The silver locket felt warm against Evelyn Ashcroft's skin, even though the October air biting through her silk gown was cold enough to make her shiver. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the chandeliers sway gently above the swirling dancers, and for the 100th time that night, her fingers found the tiny clasp at her throat. Inside that locket was a photograph of her mother, taken 20 years ago, when her mother had been just 22 years old herself. Same age as Evelyn now. Same family name to protect. Same engagement party to get through. The year was 1923, and Ashcroft Manor in Wiltshire, England, had been transformed for the occasion. 36 servants had worked for 2 full days, polishing the oak floors until they gleamed, hanging garlands of autumn leaves along every windowsill, and positioning hundreds of white candles in the crystal chandeliers that had been in Evelyn's family for 5 generations. Tonight was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Tonight was when the village would toast to her future with Lord Philip Blackwood, heir to an estate even larger than Ashcroft Manor, a man whose family name appeared in history books alongside kings and princes. Evelyn smiled at everyone who approached her. She said all the right things. Yes, the weather had turned so cold. Yes, the decorations were absolutely lovely. Yes, she was terribly excited about the wedding in June. But her eyes kept drifting toward the tall windows that lined the eastern wall, the ones that faced the gardens. Beyond those windows, past the terrace and the fountain and the rows of trimmed hedges, the world was dark and quiet. The outside air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves. She could almost taste it from here, and that taste felt more real than the champagne bubbles on her tongue. "Miss Ashcroft, you look absolutely radiant tonight." Evelyn turned to find Mrs. Holloway, the vicar's wife, beaming at her with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Holloway had known Evelyn since she was a baby, had watched her grow from a scraped-knee child into this young woman in white silk. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway." Evelyn's voice came out steady, practiced. "Your mother would be so proud." Mrs. Holloway pressed Evelyn's hand between her warm, soft palms. "She always said you'd make a brilliant match. And Philip is such a catch, isn't he? So distinguished. So proper." Proper. That was the word everyone used for Philip. Proper manners. Proper family. Proper fortune. No one ever said he was kind. No one ever mentioned that his smiles never quite reached his eyes. Evelyn thanked Mrs. Holloway and excused herself, claiming she needed a moment to fix her hair. The lie came easily. She'd gotten good at lying over the past few months, ever since her father had announced that Philip had asked for her hand, and she'd said yes without thinking, without feeling, without any voice inside her saying this was what she wanted. The powder room was empty, thankfully. Evelyn stood at the mirror and studied her own face. Dark hair pinned up with pearl clips. Cheeks flushed from the heat of too many bodies pressed together. Eyes that looked older than 22. She opened the locket. Inside, her mother smiled at her, frozen in time, wearing a gown from a different decade. Margaret Ashcroft had been 22 when this photograph was taken. 22 and engaged to a man her family had chosen. 22 and already beginning to fade. Evelyn's mother had died when Evelyn was 15. The official cause had been pneumonia, but the servants whispered other things. They said she'd died of loneliness, of a spirit slowly crushed, of a heart that had stopped wanting to beat. Evelyn snapped the locket shut and walked back toward the ballroom. But instead of returning to the crowd, she turned down a side corridor, then another, until she reached the small door that led to the terrace. She needed air. Real air. Air that didn't smell like perfume and candle wax. The terrace stones were cold beneath her thin dancing shoes. She wrapped her arms around herself and walked to the stone railing, looking down at the garden below. The moon was bright enough to see the shapes of things, the fountain, the hedges, the greenhouse at the far end, and a figure moving near the roses. Evelyn's heart jumped. For a moment, she thought about going back inside. But something about the way the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, carefully, made her curious instead of afraid. She gathered her skirts and descended the stone steps into the garden. The cold hit her fully now, raising goosebumps along her bare arms. She followed the gravel path toward the rose garden, her footsteps crunching softly. The figure hadn't noticed her yet. He was kneeling in the dirt, his hands working the soil around the base of a rose bush that had long since stopped blooming. She recognized him when she got closer. James, the new groundskeeper. He'd arrived in August, just a few months ago, hired by her father to replace old Mr. Timms, who had finally retired at 73. She'd seen him from her window, working in the gardens, but she'd never been this close to him before. "Those ones are pretending to be alive," he said without looking up. Evelyn stopped. "I'm sorry." James stood slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. In the moonlight, she could see him properly for the first time. Young, maybe 24. Dark hair falling across his forehead. Eyes that held something she couldn't name. His hands were covered in soil, the nails dirty, the skin rough. He gestured at the rose bush. "This one. And these two beside it. They look dead, but they're not. The roots are still good. They just need someone to dig around them, give them room to breathe." He glanced at her gown, at the pearls in her hair, at her hands pale and bare of dirt. "You'll catch cold out here." "I needed air." Evelyn heard how defensive she sounded, like a child caught sneaking out of bed. "The ballroom is so crowded." James nodded like he understood, though how could he? He'd probably never been inside a ballroom in his life. He lived in the small cottage near the greenhouse, the one with the blue door that needed painting. She'd walked past it 100 times without really seeing it. "How do you know," she asked, stepping closer to the rose bush, "that they're still alive?" James crouched down again and gestured for her to join him. Evelyn hesitated for only a second before gathering her skirts and kneeling on the cold ground, heedless of what the dirt might do to the silk. He took her hand, his fingers warm despite the cold, rough against her soft skin, and guided it to the base of the bush. "Feel there. Right at the bottom, where the stem meets the soil." She felt nothing at first. Just dry, brittle wood. But then, beneath her fingertips, she caught it. The slightest resistance. The tiniest hint of firmness where everything else was dead and dry. "There," James said softly. "That's where the life is. Waiting." Evelyn looked up and found him watching her. Not her gown or her pearls or her famous name, but her. Really her. For one long moment, neither of them moved. "Evelyn." The voice came from the terrace above. Philip's voice. Sharp. Impatient. James released her hand immediately and stood, stepping back into the shadow of the hedge. Evelyn rose too, her heart pounding, her palms suddenly damp despite the cold. "Evelyn, are you out there?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came. She looked at James, standing perfectly still in the darkness, and then at the terrace where Philip's silhouette waited. "I'm coming," she finally managed. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She hurried back toward the steps, not daring to look behind her. As she climbed, the smell of the garden clung to her. Wet earth, cut grass, the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. It mixed with the cold air and filled her lungs, and by the time she reached Philip at the top of the steps, she could still taste it on her tongue. "There you are." Philip offered his arm, his smile perfectly proper, his eyes perfectly cold. "You'll catch your death out here. Come inside where you belong." Evelyn took his arm. She let him lead her back into the warmth, back into the light, back into the crowd of noble names and proper smiles. But the smell of earth stayed with her. And somewhere deep in the cold October ground, beneath a rose bush that looked dead, something alive was waiting. Sometimes the smallest moments change everything. A single glance. A touch that lasts 1 second too long. A scent that refuses to leave. Evelyn didn't know it yet, standing there in her white silk gown with a perfect fiancé beside her, but the life she'd always known was about to end. And something new, something real, was about to begin. 3 weeks had passed since the engagement party, but Evelyn could still smell the garden on her skin every time she closed her eyes. It made no sense, of course. She had bathed dozens of times since that night. Her maid had scrubbed her back with lavender soap until she smelled like a field in summer. But the memory of damp earth and cut grass stayed with her, a secret she carried everywhere. It was November now, and the mornings came late and cold. Evelyn took to waking before dawn, claiming she wanted to practice the piano while the house was quiet. Her father approved of this. Music was a proper pursuit for a young lady, so no one questioned why she slipped out the side door instead of going to the music room. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the garden, past the fountain and the hedges, just before the woods began. Its glass panels were fogged with condensation in the cold weather, and from a distance, it looked like something from a dream. Evelyn reached it just as the first pale light began to touch the sky. James was already there. He was always there. He had a small pot-bellied stove in the corner of the greenhouse, and he kept it burning through the night to protect the tender seedlings. When Evelyn pushed open the creaking door, warmth rushed out to meet her, carrying the smell of damp soil and growing things. "You came," James said. He was kneeling by a tray of tiny green shoots, his hands covered in dirt, just like that first night. "I said I would." Evelyn closed the door behind her and leaned against it, suddenly aware of how fast her heart was beating. She had worn her plainest dress, a grey wool thing that had once belonged to a servant before her maid had altered it. No pearls tonight. No silk. Just wool and cotton and her mother's locket, warm against her skin. James stood and crossed to her. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the dark circles under his eyes, the slight roughness of his jaw where he hadn't shaved. Close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his body. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "If someone finds out." "I know." Evelyn's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know what happens if someone finds out." They both knew. A girl like Evelyn, engaged to a man like Philip, couldn't be seen alone with a groundskeeper at dawn. It wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be a destruction. Her name, her family's name, everything her mother had sacrificed for, it would all turn to ash. And yet here she stood. "I brought you something." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much. Just something I thought you might like." Evelyn unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small pot, no bigger than her palm, holding a tiny green seedling with 2 delicate leaves. She looked up at him, confused. "It's from the rose bush," James explained. "The one you helped me with that night. I took a cutting. If you plant it somewhere, it'll grow. A piece of the garden you can keep." Evelyn's throat tightened. No one had ever given her anything like this. Philip gave her jewelry, expensive and cold. Her father gave her permission to use his name. But this tiny living thing, grown from soil and care and hope, this was different. "Thank you," she whispered. They fell into a pattern after that. Every morning, Evelyn slipped out before dawn and met James in the greenhouse. They didn't plan it. It just happened. She would arrive shivering, and he would have the stove burning hot. She would sit on an old wooden crate while he worked, and they would talk. He told her about the war, about France, about the trenches, about the mud that swallowed men whole. He had enlisted at 18, too young to understand what he was signing up for. He had watched friends die beside him, had carried one for 3 miles through shellfire only to watch him bleed out on a hospital cot. When the war ended, he couldn't go back to his old life. Nothing felt real anymore except the soil, except watching things grow from death. Evelyn told him about her mother, about the woman who had smiled in photographs but never in person, about the way she would sit by the window for hours, just staring at nothing, about the night she died, when Evelyn had held her hand and felt it grow cold. "I think she stopped wanting to live," Evelyn said one morning, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think she just gave up." James didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't say it would be okay or that she was wrong. He just listened, and somehow that was better. In return, he showed her things. How to tell which seeds were healthy by their color. How to pinch back young plants to make them grow stronger. How to feel in the soil whether a plant needed water. His hands guided hers, warm and rough, and each touch lasted a moment longer than necessary. Evelyn's hands started to change. Small calluses formed on her palms. Dirt collected under her nails no matter how carefully she scrubbed. Her maid noticed and clucked with concern, pressing creams and pumice stones into Evelyn's hands, trying to restore them to proper softness. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into their secret, when everything shifted. Evelyn arrived at the greenhouse to find James standing by the stove, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "What's wrong?" she asked. He turned, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Fear. "I have to leave," he said. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "Leave? Why? What happened?" James ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of dirt behind. "Lord Blackwood came to see me yesterday. He said he'd heard rumors about a woman visiting the greenhouse at dawn." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. "Did he see you? Did he recognize?" "No." James shook his head. "But he will. If I stay, he'll figure it out. And when he does..." He trailed off, but they both knew what came next. Evelyn crossed the space between them and took his hands. His fingers closed around hers automatically, like they belonged there. "Then we stop meeting," she said. "We wait. We let things settle, and then..." "No." James's voice was firm. "You don't understand. He didn't just warn me. He offered me money to leave. Said he'd make sure I found work somewhere else, somewhere far away. He's trying to get rid of me." Evelyn stared at him. Philip knew. Not everything, maybe, but enough. Enough to want James gone. "I won't go," James said quietly. "Not unless you tell me to. But if I stay, we have to be careful. More careful than this. And you have to decide what you really want." Evelyn looked around the greenhouse, at the seedlings, at the stove, at the fogged glass panels that held the world at bay. She thought about Philip's cold smile, about her mother's empty eyes, about the tiny rose cutting she had planted in a pot hidden in her wardrobe. "I know what I want," she said. "I've known since that first night in the garden." James lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek, closing his eyes. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in warmth while the cold world waited outside. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in her four-poster bed, staring at the canopy above, replaying every moment in the greenhouse. The way James looked at her, the way her name sounded in his voice, the way her heart raced every time she pushed open that creaking door. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hall. She sat up, heart pounding, expecting her father or a servant. But the footsteps passed her door and continued toward the back stairs. The next morning, she hurried to the greenhouse earlier than usual. The stove was cold. The seedlings sat untouched. And on the table where she usually sat, there was a small piece of paper, weighted down by a stone. She picked it up with shaking hands. The note was short, written in James's uneven script. Asterisk gone to the village for supplies. Back by noon. Wait for me. Asterisk. Evelyn exhaled with relief and tucked the note into her pocket. She decided to wait, to sit right here in the warmth until he returned. But by noon, he hadn't come back. By evening, she heard the news from a serving girl who didn't know she was listening. "Did you hear? That new groundskeeper got arrested. Trying to sell stolen jewelry in the village, they say. A silver locket. Can you imagine?" Evelyn's hand flew to her throat. The locket. Her mother's locket. The one she had given James for safekeeping just last week. She stumbled to her room and opened her wardrobe, pushing aside dresses until she found the small pot with the rose cutting. It sat there, innocent and green, the only proof that the last 3 weeks had been real. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. Philip hadn't just warned James. He had framed him. He had taken the one thing Evelyn had given freely and turned it into a weapon. The man who spoke of souls and roses, who touched her with reverence, who gave her living things instead of cold jewelry, that man was now sitting in a cold cell, branded a common thief. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the wardrobe door and felt the first tears slide down her cheeks. Somewhere in the village, the locket lay in evidence, waiting to condemn them both. And somewhere in the manor, Philip was smiling his proper smile, certain that he had won. But he didn't know Evelyn yet. He didn't know that the girl who seemed so fragile had roots deeper than anyone suspected. He didn't know that when you try to destroy something precious, you don't always succeed. Sometimes, you just help it grow. The rose cutting sat in its small pot, reaching toward the light. And in the darkness, Evelyn made a decision. She would not let James be destroyed. She would not let Philip win. She had been asleep her whole life, but now she was finally awake. Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that wake us up. The ones that show us what we are really made of. Evelyn Ashcroft had spent 22 years being proper and quiet and good. But proper and quiet and good hadn't saved her mother. And it wasn't going to save James. It was time to fight. By Christmas Eve, the frost had killed every living thing in the garden. Evelyn stood at her bedroom window, watching the weak afternoon sun glint off ice-covered branches, and tried to remember what the roses had looked like in bloom. She couldn't. That memory already felt like it belonged to someone else. 3 weeks had passed since James's arrest. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of pretending everything was normal while the world crumbled around her. The official story, repeated by servants and villagers alike, was simple. The groundskeeper had tried to sell a valuable silver locket in the village. The shopkeeper, an honest man named Mr. Abernathy, had recognized the Ashcroft family crest and asked questions. When James couldn't explain how he came to possess such an item, Mr. Abernathy had sent for the constable. Case closed. No one mentioned that James had worked at the manor for months without incident. No one asked why a man with no previous record would suddenly turn to theft. No one wondered about the timing, just weeks before Christmas, just weeks after Lord Philip Blackwood had paid a private visit to the groundskeeper's cottage. Evelyn knew. She knew everything. She knew that Philip had taken the locket from James's room. She knew that Philip had paid Mr. Abernathy to play along. She knew because Philip had told her, not in words, but in glances. In the satisfied little smile he wore whenever someone mentioned the scandal. In the way he touched her hand at dinner and said, "It's terrible when you trust the wrong people, isn't it, my dear?" But knowing and proving were different things. And Evelyn was trapped. Her father had confined her to the manor after the news broke. Not as punishment, he claimed, but for her own protection. "We can't have you associated with this business," he'd said, pouring himself a brandy with steady hands. "The name must come first. It always must come first." The name. Everyone talked about the name. The Ashcroft name. The Blackwood name. Noble names that had survived wars and plagues and political upheavals. Names that would apparently crumble to dust if anyone discovered that a 22-year-old girl had fallen in love with the groundskeeper. Evelyn stopped eating. Not deliberately at first. Food just lost its taste. She would sit at the long dining table, alone except for her father at the opposite end, and push roast potatoes around her plate until they grew cold. Her dresses began to hang loose on her frame. Her maid clucked and fretted and brought trays of tea and biscuits that went untouched. At night, she didn't sleep. She lay in her four-poster bed, staring at the canopy, replaying every moment in the greenhouse. The way James's hands had guided hers in the soil. The way he'd looked at her when she talked about her mother. The tiny rose cutting, still alive and its pot hidden in her wardrobe, the only proof that any of it had been real. She tried to send him a message. She bribed a stable boy with a month's allowance to carry a letter to the village jail. The boy came back an hour later, shamefaced, the letter still in his pocket. "They won't let nobody see him, miss. Constable's orders. Special instructions from Lord Blackwood, they say." Special instructions. Of course. On Christmas morning, Evelyn woke to find a small velvet box on her breakfast tray. Inside sat a diamond ring, larger and more brilliant than her engagement ring. A card read, "For my future wife. May all your Christmases be as bright. With eternal devotion, Philip." Evelyn stared at the ring until her eyes blurred. Then she closed the box, set it aside, and went to the window. The garden lay frozen and dead. No roses. No greenhouse visits. No James. She wondered where he was right now. What he was eating, if anything. Whether he was warm enough. whether he hated her for not saving him. That afternoon, the family gathered for Christmas dinner. Philip sat beside her, carving the turkey with practiced elegance, making polite conversation with her father about land prices and hunting seasons. Evelyn smiled when expected, nodded when expected, said all the right things. "Evelyn, my dear, you look pale." Philip touched her cheek with cold fingers. "You mustn't let this unpleasant business trouble you. These things happen. The lower classes, you know. They can't help themselves." Evelyn's hand tightened on her fork until her knuckles went white. "He didn't do it," she said quietly. Philip's smile didn't waver. "Of course he did, darling. The evidence speaks for itself. Now, shall we have some of this excellent pudding?" After dinner, while the others retired to the drawing room for port and cigars, Evelyn slipped away. She walked through the frozen garden, her thin shoes soaking through with cold, until she reached the greenhouse. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was dead. The seedlings James had nurtured were brown and withered. The stove sat cold and dark. Frost covered the inside of the glass panels, turning the space into an ice palace. Evelyn sank onto the wooden crate where she'd sat so many mornings and buried her face in her hands. This was her fault. All of it. If she hadn't come to the garden that first night. If she hadn't given James the locket. If she hadn't let herself fall in love with a man she could never have. James would still be free. He'd still have his job, his cottage, his seedlings. He'd still have a life. And what had she given him in return? A few stolen hours. A few whispered conversations. A silver locket that had become his prison sentence. She looked up at the frosted glass and saw her reflection staring back. Pale. Thin. Hollow-eyed. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. Then she did. She looked exactly like her mother. That same defeated slump in the shoulders. That same emptiness behind the eyes. That same acceptance of a life she hadn't chosen. Her mother had sat by windows just like this, staring at gardens just like this, waiting for something that never came. And then she had died, not from pneumonia, but from the slow suffocation of a spirit that had nowhere left to go. Evelyn stood abruptly, her heart pounding. Was that her future? 20 more years of dinners with Philip, of smiling when she wanted to scream, of watching everything beautiful wither and die. Would she end up like her mother, cold and still, while the noble names marched on without her? No. She couldn't. She wouldn't. But what could she do? She was one woman, trapped in a manor, watched by servants, engaged to a man who held all the power. James sat in a jail cell 3 miles away, and she couldn't even send him a letter. Philip had won. The noble names had won. They always won. Evelyn walked back to the manor through the dying light, her feet numb with cold, her heart heavier than it had ever been. That night, she dreamed of her mother. They were sitting together in the garden, but the garden was on fire, and her mother was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in Evelyn's memory. "I should have run," her mother said. "I should have run when I still could." Evelyn woke with tears on her face and the taste of smoke in her mouth. 2 days after Christmas, a letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to Evelyn directly. It came to the kitchen, hidden inside a loaf of bread delivered by a traveling baker. The cook, a kind woman named Mrs. Patmore who had known Evelyn since birth, slipped it to her when no one was watching. Evelyn took it to her room and opened it with shaking hands. The handwriting was smudged, the paper cheap and creased. But the words were James's. Asterisk, my dearest Evelyn, asterisk. Asterisk, I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if you even want to hear from me. But I need you to know the truth. Asterisk. Asterisk, I did not sell your locket. I would never sell anything you gave me. Philip came to my cottage the night before I was arrested. He said he knew about us. He said he would destroy your name, tell your father everything, make sure you were shamed beyond recovery. He said if I left quietly, with nothing, he would let you go. He would break the engagement and let you find someone else, someone suitable. Asterisk. Asterisk, I agreed. I packed my bag. I was going to leave at dawn. But that night, While I slept, he came back. He took the locket from under my pillow. I woke and saw him standing there, holding it, smiling that smile of his. He said, "Now you have nothing. And neither does she." Asterisk. Asterisk, I should have fought him. I should have stopped him. But he had 2 men with him, men I'd never seen before. They held me down while he left. And in the morning, the constable arrived. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't care what happens to me. I care what happens to you. Don't marry him, Evelyn. Don't let him take your light the way he took mine. Run. Run while you still can. Asterisk. Asterisk, I love you. I've loved you since that first night in the garden, when you knelt in the dirt in your beautiful gown and let me show you where the life was hiding. Asterisk. Asterisk, yours always. Asterisk. Asterisk, James. Asterisk. Evelyn read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it to her heart. And then she realized that everything she'd believed for the past 3 weeks was a lie. She'd thought James had betrayed her. She'd thought he'd sold the locket for money, for survival, for any reason that made his silence bearable. She'd thought she'd been wrong about him, wrong about everything, wrong to trust her heart. But she hadn't been wrong. James had tried to protect her. He'd been willing to disappear, to lose everything, just to save her name. And Philip had taken that sacrifice and twisted it into something ugly. Evelyn stood up. She crossed to her wardrobe and opened it. There, in the back, behind her winter coats, sat the small pot with the rose cutting. It was still alive. Still green. Still reaching toward the light. She touched one tiny leaf with her fingertip and made a decision. The noble names had ruled for centuries. They had crushed everyone who stood in their way. They had destroyed her mother. They had framed an innocent man. They had decided that Evelyn's future belonged to them. But they were wrong. Evelyn Ashcroft was done being proper. Done being quiet. Done being good. It was time to remind them that even the smallest seed could crack the strongest stone. The new year arrived with a cold so bitter it froze the fountain solid and turned the garden into a crystal forest. But inside Ashcroft Manor, Evelyn Ashcroft burned with a heat she had never felt before. January 2nd, 1924. Evelyn sat at her vanity, studying her reflection in the morning light. The girl who looked back at her was thinner than the one who had danced at an engagement party 3 months ago. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her cheeks had lost their fullness. But something else had changed too. Something in the way she held her jaw. Something in the steadiness of her gaze. She looked like someone who had nothing left to lose. And that, she realized, was her greatest weapon. For 2 weeks, Evelyn played a role more convincing than any actress on the London stage. She smiled at Philip when he visited. She accepted his gifts with grateful words. She let him hold her hand at dinner and press dry kisses to her cheek when he left. She became exactly what he wanted her to be, a broken girl, properly chastened by scandal, ready to be molded into a proper wife. "You're handling this whole business remarkably well," Philip said on January 15th, as they walked through the frozen garden together. His arm was tucked through hers, possessive and secure. "I knew you had strength, my dear. It's one of the things I admire about you." Evelyn smiled up at him, her eyes wide and innocent. "I have you to thank for that. You've been so supportive through everything." Philip preened. He actually preened, like a bird puffing its feathers. He had no idea that beneath her soft words, Evelyn was cataloguing every detail of his face, every habit, every weakness. She was learning him the way James had taught her to learn the soil. Slowly, carefully, looking for the place where life hid. Or in Philip's case, the place where rot had already set in. That night, Evelyn wrote her first letter. Not to James, she still couldn't reach him directly, but to Mrs. Holloway, the vicar's wife who had known Evelyn since she was a baby. Mrs. Holloway loved gossip the way roses loved sunlight. She couldn't help herself. And she had a son who worked at the village constable's office. Dear Mrs. Holloway, Evelyn wrote, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about our conversation at the engagement party, about how you always knew my mother would want me to make a brilliant match. You were so kind to share those memories. I wonder if you might visit sometime? I do get lonely here, and I'd love to hear more stories about the old days. It was nothing. A friendly note from a lonely girl. But tucked inside was a tiny folded paper that said, Ask your son about the groundskeeper's arrest. Who really brought the charges? 3 days later, Mrs. Holloway came to tea. She was flustered and excited, her cheeks pink with the pleasure of carrying secrets. You'll never guess what my Thomas told me, she whispered over cucumber sandwiches. About that groundskeeper business. He says the whole thing smells funny. Lord Blackwood himself brought the evidence to the constable. Did you know that? And paid Mr. Abernathy a visit the day before, though Mr. Abernathy won't admit it. Thomas says the constable's uncomfortable with the whole thing, but with a man like Lord Blackwood involved, what can he do? Evelyn poured tea with steady hands. That does seem odd, she said mildly. Why would Lord Blackwood be so involved in a simple theft case? Mrs. Holloway leaned forward, her eyes bright. That's exactly what Thomas said. He says there's more to this than anyone's letting on. But of course, we mustn't speak ill of our betters. She sat back, satisfied with her contribution to the day's gossip. Evelyn smiled and offered more sandwiches. The seed was planted. Now she just had to water it. Throughout January, Evelyn continued her quiet campaign. She wrote letters to everyone who might help. Her mother's old friends, women who had known Margaret Ashcroft before she faded, distant cousins who might owe the family favours, the local magistrate's wife, who had once confided that she found Philip Blackwood entirely too pleased with himself. To each person, Evelyn told a slightly different story. To one, she expressed concern about the groundskeeper's welfare. Such a young man, surely he deserved a second chance? To another, she wondered aloud about the locket itself, mentioning that it had been her mother's and had gone missing weeks before the arrest. To a third, she simply looked sad and said, I do hope justice is being served. It's what my mother would have wanted. She never accused anyone directly. She never mentioned Philip's name. She just planted seeds, small and harmless looking, and waited for them to grow. By the first week of February, the seeds had begun to sprout. The magistrate's wife mentioned at a dinner party that she'd heard disturbing questions about the Ashcroft theft case. Mrs. Holloway's son let slip that the constable had started quietly reviewing the evidence. A shopkeeper in the village mentioned to a customer that Mr. Abernathy had seemed nervous as a cat whenever Lord Blackwood's name came up. Philip noticed nothing. He was too busy planning the wedding, too confident in his victory, too certain that the broken girl he'd created would never fight back. You know, he said on February 10th, twirling Evelyn around the drawing room in an impromptu dance, I think we should marry in the spring. April, perhaps. No point in waiting, is there? The sooner you're Mrs. Blackwood, the sooner we can put all this unpleasantness behind us. Evelyn laughed and let him spin her. April sounds lovely, she said. And she meant it. By April, she would either be free or destroyed. Either way, the waiting would be over. That night, she received a letter that made her hand shake. It was from the magistrate's wife, written in careful, looping script. My dear Evelyn I've made some inquiries, as you requested. The situation is more complicated than it appears. The constable has reviewed the evidence and found several inconsistencies. Most notably, the locket was reported as evidence before the groundskeeper was even arrested, meaning someone must have known in advance that a crime would occur. Additionally, Mr. Abernathy has changed his story 3 times under gentle questioning. The constable cannot act without proof, but he has agreed to one thing. If new evidence emerges, he will reopen the case. He asked me to tell you this personally. I don't know what game you're playing, Evelyn Ashcroft, but I remember your mother, and I remember what the world did to her. If you're half the woman she could have been, you'll see this through. Yours in confidence. Margaret Whittaker. Evelyn read the letter 3 times. Then she burned it in her candle flame and watched the ashes curl into nothing. New evidence. That's what she needed. Something that would prove Philip's involvement. Something that couldn't be explained away. She thought about the night of the engagement party. About Philip's cold smile. About the way he'd called her name from the terrace. About the locket, warm against her skin, that she'd given to James for safekeeping. And she remembered something else. Something she hadn't thought about in months. The night before James was arrested, Philip had dined at Ashcroft Manor. He'd arrived early, claiming he wanted to discuss wedding plans with Evelyn's father. But he'd been gone for nearly an hour before dinner, and when Evelyn had asked where he'd gone, he'd said he was exploring the gardens. The gardens. Where James's cottage Saturday. Where James kept his few belongings, including the locket. Evelyn closed her eyes and pictured that night. Philip's boots, slightly muddy despite his claim that he'd stayed on the paths. A scratch on his hand that he'd explained away as a shaving nick. The way he'd avoided looking directly at her during dinner. He'd been in James's cottage. He'd taken the locket. And he'd left something behind. It was a long shot. A very long shot. But Evelyn had nothing else. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Philip arrived with flowers and chocolates and plans for their April wedding. Evelyn accepted them all with pretty smiles and thank you words. And while he sat in the drawing room, discussing guest lists with her father, Evelyn slipped out the side door and ran through the frozen garden to James's cottage. The door was padlocked. Of course it was. But the window beside it had a cracked pane, and Evelyn was small and determined. She wrapped her hand in her wool skirt and pushed gently. The glass gave way with a soft tinkle. She climbed through, landing on the cold floor of the cottage where James had lived. His bed sat stripped and bare. His few possessions were gone, probably taken as evidence or thrown away. But Evelyn wasn't looking for his things. She was looking for Philip's. She searched for an hour, her fingers numb with cold, her breath fogging in the air. Under the bed. In the cupboards. Behind the small stove. Nothing. She was about to give up when she noticed a loose floorboard near the window. It stuck up slightly, just enough to catch her eye. She knelt and worked her fingernails into the gap, prying it up. Beneath the board, in the dusty space between floor and foundation, lay a small leather notebook. Evelyn pulled it out with shaking hands. She opened it. Philip's handwriting. Dates. Names. Amounts of money. A record of every bribe he'd ever paid, every secret he'd ever bought, every person he'd ever destroyed. The last entry was dated December 2nd, 1923. Asterisk paid Abernathy £50. Paid constable's deputy £20. Locket secured. Groundskeeper will be gone by Christmas. Evelyn will be mine. Asterisk. Evelyn read the entry 3 times. Then she closed the book, tucked it inside her coat, and climbed back through the broken window. She walked slowly back to the manor, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Through the frozen garden. Past the dead roses. Up the terrace steps where Philip had called her name that first night. When she entered the drawing room, Philip was still there, still talking to her father, still wearing that satisfied smile. He looked up when she entered. There you are, darling. I was beginning to wonder where you'd gone. His eyes narrowed slightly. You look flushed. Are you feeling well? Evelyn smiled. It was the most genuine smile she'd given him in months. I'm feeling wonderful, she said. Actually, I was just thinking about our wedding. Philip's face relaxed. Oh, what about it? Evelyn crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough to smell his cologne, close enough to see the tiny pulse beating in his throat. I think April is too far away, she said softly. I think we should marry sooner. Much sooner. Philip's eyebrows rose. How much sooner? Evelyn reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were still cold from the garden, but he didn't seem to notice. Tomorrow, she said. I want to marry you tomorrow. Philip stared at her. Then he laughed, delighted. Tomorrow? Darling, we can't possibly. I've already spoken to Father. He agrees. A quiet ceremony, just family. Then we can announce it after. Think of the romantic story it will make. So impatient for each other we couldn't wait another day. Philip's smile widened. This was better than he dreamed. The broken girl, so eager to lock herself to him that she'd throw away any chance of escape. If that's what you really want, he said. Evelyn squeezed his hand. It's what I really want. That night, after Philip had gone home and her father had retired, Evelyn sat at her desk and wrote one final letter. This one was addressed to the magistrate, to be delivered first thing in the morning. Inside, she included one item, a single page from Philip's notebook, the one with the entry about December 2nd. And she wrote, *at noon tomorrow, I will be at the village church, marrying Philip Blackwood. At 12:15, you will find James the groundskeeper still in his cell. I trust you to do what is right. She sealed the letter and gave it to a stable boy with instructions to deliver it at exactly 11 o'clock in the morning. Not a minute before. Then she went to her wardrobe and took out the small pot with the rose cutting. It had grown in the weeks since James's arrest. New leaves. New strength. New life. She touched one tiny leaf and whispered into the darkness. Tomorrow, James. Tomorrow we find out if love is stronger than hate. The morning of February 15th dawned clear and cold. Evelyn dressed in a simple white gown, not the elaborate creation she'd planned for April. She pinned her hair with pearls. She put on her mother's locket, returned to her by the constable after James's arrest, and she walked to the village church with Philip beside her, her hand in his, her heart steady as stone. The church was small and cold. Only a handful of guests sat in the pews. Her father, Philip's mother, a few servants. Mrs. Holloway, her eyes bright with curiosity. The vicar began the service. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Evelyn watched the door. To join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The minute hand on the church clock crept toward 12:15. If any person can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence. Philip squeezed her hand. And then the church door burst open. The magistrate stood there, his face grim. Behind him, 2 constables. And behind them, Mr. Abernathy, the shopkeeper, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. Stop this wedding, the magistrate said. Lord Philip Blackwood, you're under arrest. Philip's hand went cold in Evelyn's. This is absurd. On what charge? The magistrate walked forward, holding up the page from Philip's notebook. Bribery. Fraud. False imprisonment. And that's just for starters. Philip's face went white. He turned to Evelyn, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. You, he whispered. You did this. Evelyn looked at him steadily. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him the way she'd looked at the dead roses months ago, like she was seeing him for what he really was. I did, she said quietly. And I'd do it again. The constables moved forward. Philip tried to pull away, to run, but they caught him easily. As they dragged him down the aisle, past the shocked faces of the wedding guests, he twisted back to look at Evelyn one last time. She's lying, he shouted. She's a liar. She was with him. She loved him. But no one listened. No one believed him. Because Evelyn stood there in her white gown, her mother's locket at her throat, looking for all the world like a wronged woman finally getting justice. The door closed behind Philip. The church fell silent. And then, from the back of the church, a figure rose from the shadows of the last pew. James. He was thinner than she remembered. Pale from months in a cell. His clothes hung loose on his frame. But his eyes were the same. Warm. Steady. Full of light. He walked toward her down the aisle, past the gasping guests, past her father's stunned face, past Mrs. Holloway's dropped jaw. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he reached out and touched the locket at her throat. You did it, he said softly. You saved us. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I learned from the best, she whispered. You taught me that even things that look dead can still have life in them." James smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile in months, and it was like watching the sun come out after a long winter. Outside the church, the February sun broke through the clouds, and somewhere, in a small pot in Evelyn's wardrobe, a rose cutting reached toward the light. Sometimes the longest nights produce the brightest dawns. Sometimes the coldest winters give way to the most beautiful springs. Evelyn Ashcroft had spent months in darkness, but she had never stopped growing. She had never stopped reaching toward the light. And now, finally, the light had reached back. Spring came late to Wiltshire that year, but when it finally arrived in early April 1924, it arrived all at once. Evelyn stood at the kitchen door of the groundskeeper's cottage, watching the rainfall in soft sheets across the garden, and thought about how different everything looked now that the world was green again. 3 months had passed since the day in the church. 3 months since Philip had been dragged away in front of everyone. 3 months since Evelyn had stood in her white gown and watched her old life crumble to dust. The trial had been quick. With Philip's own notebook as evidence, with Mr. Abernathy finally telling the truth, with the constable's deputy confessing his part in exchange for leniency, the case against Lord Philip Blackwood had been overwhelming. The noble name that was supposed to protect him had crumbled. The title that was supposed to make him untouchable had become meaningless. In the end, he was just a man in a prison cell, staring at walls while the world moved on without him. Evelyn's father had not taken it well. For 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, he had refused to speak to her. He walked past her in hallways like she was invisible. He ate his meals in his study, alone. The Ashcroft name, the thing he had spent his whole life protecting, was now stained beyond repair. His daughter had helped send a lord to prison. His daughter had chosen a groundskeeper over a nobleman. His daughter had destroyed everything. But something strange happened as the weeks passed. The scandal that was supposed to ruin them didn't. The village, it turned out, had never liked Philip much. The servants, it turned out, had always known what kind of man he was. And the noble families who had once filled the ballroom at Ashcroft Manor? They stayed away, yes. But Evelyn found she didn't miss them. "I never liked any of them anyway," she told James one rainy afternoon in mid-March. They were sitting in the greenhouse, which James had spent weeks restoring. New seedlings lined the tables. The stove burned warm. Life had returned. They were always so cold. James laughed. He laughed more now, freely and often. Freedom did that to a person, Evelyn had learned. Months in a cell could break a spirit, but James's spirit had refused to break. He said it was because he'd had something to hold on to. Someone to hold on to. "You're not cold," he said, reaching across to tuck a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "You never were. You were just frozen for a while. Like the roses." Evelyn thought about that now, standing in the cottage doorway, watching the April rain. She had moved into the cottage 3 weeks ago. Not because she had to. Her father had eventually come around, had even apologized in his awkward, stiff way, but because she wanted to. The manor was too big. Too empty. Too full of ghosts. The cottage was small. 2 rooms downstairs, 1 bedroom upstairs. The kitchen had a wood stove that smoked when the wind blew wrong. The floors creaked in places. The blue door was still chipped and needed painting. It was the most beautiful home Evelyn had ever known. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the stairs. James came down, still buttoning his shirt, his hair wet from the rain he'd walked through on his way back from the greenhouse. "You're up early," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Couldn't sleep." Evelyn leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body through his thin shirt. "I was thinking about the engagement party," she said. "About that night in the garden. About how different everything looked then." James wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Together they watched the rain fall on the garden, on the greenhouse in the distance, on the roses that were just beginning to show their first buds. "You were wearing white," he said softly. "You looked like something from another world. Like a ghost, almost. So beautiful I couldn't breathe. So far away I couldn't reach you. Evelyn smiled. And now? James turned her gently in his arms so she faced him. He looked at her for a long moment, at her face, which had filled out again with regular meals and peaceful sleep, at her hands, which were no longer soft and pale but bore small calluses from helping in the garden, at her eyes, which held light now instead of shadows. Now, he said, you look like you belong here. Evelyn reached up and touched his face. His skin was rough with a day's growth of beard. His eyes were the same eyes that had looked at her that first night in the garden, when she'd knelt in the dirt in her beautiful gown and let him show her where the life was hiding. I do belong here, she said. I belong with you. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, while the rain fell and the world woke up around them. Later that morning, the rain stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, and Evelyn stepped outside for the first time. The garden was transformed. Everywhere she looked, things were growing. The roses were covered in tiny green buds. The vegetable patch James had planted was showing rows of tender shoots. The greenhouse gleamed in the sunlight, its glass panels clean and clear. Evelyn walked through the garden slowly, touching things as she passed. The fountain, now running again after months of silence. The hedges, trimmed and neat. The stone steps where she'd stood that first night, looking down at a stranger who would change everything. At the bottom of the steps, near the rose garden, she stopped. The rose bush was there. The one James had been tending that night. The one she'd helped him dig around, feeling for life in the dead-looking wood. It was covered in blooms. Hundreds of them. Small and white and perfect, their petals still holding droplets of rain. They covered the bush so completely that you could barely see the leaves beneath. They filled the air with a sweetness so strong it made Evelyn's eyes sting. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without looking who it was. I didn't know they would do this, James said quietly. I hoped, but I didn't know. Evelyn reached out and touched one of the blooms. It was soft and cool and alive beneath her fingers. They waited, she said. All winter, they waited. And now? James came to stand beside her. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Evelyn heard the small click of a clasp opening, and then James was standing in front of her, holding her mother's silver locket. I've been holding on to this for too long, he said. It's time you had it back. For real this time. Evelyn looked at the locket. At the silver surface, warm from James's pocket. At the tiny clasp she had opened 1,000 times. At the photograph inside, of a woman who had died of loneliness, who had never known that her daughter would one day choose a different path. I don't need it anymore, Evelyn said softly. James looked confused. But it was your mother's. It's all you have of her. Evelyn shook her head. I have more than that. I have her eyes, her hands, her name, and I have something she never had. She looked up at James. I have you. I have this. I have a life that's actually mine. James was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, that slow smile that still made Evelyn's heart skip after all these months. Then let's give it something new to hold, he said. He reached down and plucked one of the small white roses from the bush. Carefully, gently, he opened the locket and tucked the tiny bloom inside beside the photograph of Evelyn's mother. Then he closed it and held it out to her. A new memory, he said. For a new life. Evelyn took the locket. It was warm in her palm. Warm like it had been that first night, when she'd stood in the ballroom and touched it without knowing why. She fastened it around her neck and felt it settle against her skin. It felt different now. Lighter. Not a warning or a weight, but simply a part of her. Her mother's face, and a rose from the garden where she'd found herself. James took her hand. Together they walked back through the garden, past the roses, past the fountain, past the greenhouse. Toward the cottage with the chipped blue door. Toward the life they had fought for. Toward everything that came next. That evening, as the sun set over Wiltshire, Evelyn sat on the small porch of the cottage and watched the light fade. James sat beside her, his hand in hers, his thumb tracing slow circles on her skin. The locket lay warm against her heart. I used to think love was something that happened to other people, Evelyn said quietly. People in books. People in stories. Not people like me. James squeezed her hand. And now? Evelyn looked at the garden, at the roses fading in the twilight, at the greenhouse glowing faintly with the last light of day. She thought about her mother, frozen in time in a photograph. She thought about Philip, cold and proper in his prison cell. She thought about that first night in the garden, when she'd knelt in the dirt and felt something stir beneath her fingers. Now I know better, she said. Love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose. Every day. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. James lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Was it hard? Choosing me? Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, free and full. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And the easiest. At the same time. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the garden, a night bird began to sing. The air smelled like rain and roses and the promise of summer. Evelyn thought about all the things she'd lost in the past year. Her engagement. Her reputation. Her place in the world she'd been born into. She thought about all the things she'd gained. Her freedom. Her voice. A man who loved her not despite who she was, but because of it. A garden where things grew, year after year, no matter how cold the winter got. She touched the locket at her throat and smiled. Her mother had died of a broken spirit, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. But Evelyn had chosen differently. She had chosen love over duty. She had chosen truth over comfort. She had chosen to fight, even when fighting seemed impossible. And here she was, alive, free, loved. The last light faded from the sky. The stars came out in full. And Evelyn Ashcroft, daughter of nobles, bride of a groundskeeper, sat on the porch of a tiny cottage and felt, for the first time in her life, completely at home. Sometimes the greatest victories don't look like victories at all. Sometimes they look like small things. A rose blooming after a long winter. A locket holding a new memory. A hand held in the darkness. A choice made and kept. Evelyn had learned that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up, day after day. It was about kneeling in the dirt and believing that something alive was hiding beneath the surface. It was about choosing, over and over, to reach toward the light. And as the night wrapped around her, warm and soft and full of stars, Evelyn knew that she would keep choosing it. Every day. For the rest of her life. Because that's what love does. It grows. Even in the coldest ground. Even after the longest winter. It finds a way. And so did she.